Hello and welcome to Access Matters. My name is Rebecca Potts and I head up the Access Matters initiative for Vuelio, ResponSource and Pulsar. We launched Access Matters last month to encourage listening, sharing of experience, learning from best practice and collaboration on the actions that will have the greatest positive impact for our industry. Today we're joined by the fantastic Julian Obubo, who's recently been promoted to partner and is head of diversity and inclusion at Manifest. Good morning, Julian, and congratulations again.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Hello. Julian will tell us his story covering his career in PR, the importance of developing a diverse agency, and how we can all be anti-racist. Before I hand over to Julian, I'd like to remind everybody that we're encouraging engagement, so please do submit questions using the Q&A tab on your screen or in the chat for all to see, and Julian will try to answer as many as he can. As with our previous session, we're running a poll asking, have you ever felt discriminated against in the workplace? It's anonymous and we'd love for you to take part so we can look at the results later. But for now, it's over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for joining us on this lovely, is it a Wednesday? Yeah, it's a Wednesday morning. I've been on holiday, so I'm kind of confused about what day it is. No, but it's great to be here. And as Rebecca said, what I'm going to be doing today is talking about how to become an anti-racist agency or business, but also sharing a little bit of my journey here. So I'm a partner now at Manifest, an agency in London, and for the last 4 or 5 years I've been heading up our diversity and inclusion initiatives, both in our UK offices, so that's Manchester and London, and in Stockholm and New York. And that has a lot of challenges because obviously not every region or country has the same kind of problems or structural issues when it comes to D&I. So it's been a interesting and a challenge to try and marry all those things together. And recently, I think since the unfortunate murder of George Floyd a couple of months ago, I really started thinking about our approaches, our traditional approaches to diversity and inclusion in PR, and how, I guess, ineffective or slow or ineffectual they have been, and why that was the case, and what we can do to actually build stronger, more robust, more long-term initiatives that actually do work. And so I'll go through what we put together at Manifest called How to Be an Anti-Racist Agency. And as I go through it, you're actually going to see that the first bit of it is more of a historical lesson before we actually get to the practicalities of how to bring in initiatives. Because the fundamental hypothesis that I have, and I think is true, is that we've been so quick to trying to find solutions without actually understanding what the problem is. Every reasonable person abhors racism. And there is this sort of enthusiasm to just want to start things, bring initiatives in, bring programs in, just press buttons to fix things. But if you actually do not understand the reasons why the situation is the way in the first place, then nothing's ever going to change. There's going to be a lot of hot air. There's going to be a lot of energy expended without actually changing things. So without further ado, I'll just start presenting, and I'll do it quite quickly so we can have space for some questions and answers, because I think that's what a lot of people want to do, actually have a dialogue rather than just a top-down presentation. So let me quickly share my screen. Cool. So first, we're going to look at understanding the problem. Then, secondly, understanding what systemic racism is. I'm sure it's a term that a lot of you would have heard over and over again in the last couple of months. Some of you might have done more digging as to what it is, what its origins are. And 3, we're going to look at practical steps into becoming anti-racist. So why are we gathered here in the first place. I think the typical approach to improving diversity and inclusion is broken. And I say that because we've tried to tackle our D&I issues as though it's not a direct result of racism. And I think that's because people are very uncomfortable with talking about racism, with even using the word racism. It's so heavy. It's so serious, so sobering that it might not seem like the right place to bring it into work. But we cannot address a problem while ignoring its causes and manifestations, ignoring in some cases, and just being ignorant of its causes in others. And I think because our popular definition of racism is insufficient. We look at it as racists being people on the far right, or the KKK, or avowed white supremacists, and we cannot actually see the links between those kind of manifestations of racism and what we have when we talk about things like microaggressions in the workplace. And I say our approach right now is a bit like mopping up and drying the floor without actually fixing the leak. So of course there are going to be times where you are going to have, a very dry floor, and it's going to be safe and fine to walk on. But over time, those leaks are going to appear. And I'm sure a lot of you who are attending this would have been involved in D&I discussions of some sort at your companies and agencies. And one of the conversation that always comes up is about pipeline and about the fact that yes, there might be a time for a couple of months or years where it looks like we've fixed the issue, we have a diverse team, but then if there's no one in the pipeline, if it just so happens that one or two members of your team leave, then it becomes an issue again. So what we want to do is try and find a way where that pipeline is always strong. And that is actually going beyond our agency, going beyond our industry, and trying to open up plugs in society that allows a pipeline to actually flow, a diverse pipeline to flow. And I always say you cannot fix D&I until you address systemic racism. And that sounds like, a big deal. I'm not saying that it's up to you in your individual agencies to fix it. And I'm not saying that as an individual that that can be fixed alone. Society needs all of us, it takes all of us. But we have to understand that companies and businesses can play a big role in this. But yeah, so we need to address systems, and I'll go on to explain what I mean by that. As I said, it does not feel like an organization's responsibility. And there's some parts of this that is going to be about historical issues, and you might be thinking, oh, I'm in HR, I didn't study history, why am I taking on the responsibility of doing this? And also, the most important thing, I think a big failure in how we talk about D&I is we think of it as just a workplace issue. So it's like, if we can do it in the workplace, if we can have these initiatives, if we can have these programs in the workplace, that's it. But it's wider than that. And because we don't have any jurisdiction over our employees' lives outside the workplace, if D&I is just looked on as a workplace issue, a workplace thing, then you're really never going to make long-term changes. There has to be an understanding of what the value of embracing diversity is to a person's life, and that goes beyond the workplace. And also, we feel like we don't want to politicize or indoctrinate our staff. So what I mean by our definition of racism is incomplete is that if you look at the dictionary, or if you have a conversation about racism, most of it is, as I said, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, it's prejudice or discrimination or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's race is superior. But that, I'd argue, is incomplete. And there's a historian, a friend of mine, Emma Dabry, who gives this what I think is a really good starting point, a really good definitional framework, which she says, stop vehemently denying your racist, especially to yourself. We've been conditioned to see the world through the lens of race for centuries now. Part of that worldview is the internalization of negative and reductive assumptions associated with blackness and generally positive ones associated with whiteness. What would make you immune to centuries of socialization? It's a system we've been born into. Of that you have no control. What you do have control over is what you do next. And I think also a good analogy is when we talk about sexism, sometimes it's easy to just reduce sexism to, just overt acts of misogyny. But then, especially as men, when you think about the society we've been born into that values women and contributions of women less, then we understand how insidious sexism can be. We can understand that you don't have to be an outright misogynist in order to sort of espouse sexist views. I think that analogy and that framework of thinking about we are conditioned in a society, in a system that has placed value on certain people, on white people in the UK, and has denigrated others. And you do not have to be an outright, white supremacist in order to espouse these things, because a lot of these things are internalized without, being necessarily purposeful. So I think that's a really good way of trying to understand what we have to do here. So, essentially, I'll just go quickly on this, is that what we want to do here is we want to understand various things. We want to understand how systemic racism works, how it manifests itself. As I said, we have this act first mentality that I think we should stop. We should slow down and actually understand why we need to fix things. And we want, some kind of a how-to guide. But what I want to do is back up a little bit on that act first, because a super important part of becoming an anti-racist, both as an individual and as an agency, is understanding that race is a social construct. You might have heard this a lot, especially if you did humanities in university or in high school. That's a term that comes up a lot. But what does it mean when we say race is a social construct? What we mean by that is that the racial classifications we have right now are relatively new. By relatively new, they've sort of started getting developed in the 1500s. They didn't always exist. So, of course, people always look different, but we weren't, always classified in these rigid categories. And discrimination and stereotypes have always existed. Wars have always been fought on, people looking different. But the construction of race, the popular constructions of race we have now are relatively new. So in the 17th century, when the British Empire started developing colonies in the Caribbean, one way of resolving the fact that they had brought in workers from Africa initially as just workers, and then they started enslaving them, it was to actually say, right, if we deem these people as inferior or not fully human, it then makes it easier on the consciousness to keep them permanently enslaved, to ensure that they can never ever gain freedom. If you look back at that time, there was no reason why someone from England, an Englishman, would feel necessarily any affinity with someone from France, because there was no one to contrast themselves against. So you were English, there was French, there was Spanish people, there was Portuguese people, but there was no sort of wide-ranging identity of white people because there's nothing to contrast against. So it was during European imperialism that, white people started becoming a term that was used to essentially cover a wide range of Europe in order to contrast against people that were being subjugated. And a good example of how constructed the idea of race is that for a long time, Irish people were not considered white. which might sound ridiculous to a lot of you listening, saying, well, if you look at someone, you might not be able to tell if they're Irish or Scottish or English. But back then, people would say, yeah, you can tell. If you look at their skulls or if you look at, their demeanor, you can tell. And in America, up till the early 20th century, Irish people, Italians, were not considered white. Italians were, for a long time, there was quotas on how many Italians should be allowed to emigrate into the U.S. because America wanted to deem itself a white country. Same with Jewish people in America. So, and when you look at the term Caucasian that a lot of us use quite loosely, it's just, there was a scientist in Germany, Blumenthal, who had a collection of skulls. And one of them was from the Caucasus Mountains in present-day Georgia, the country Georgia. And he was like, oh, that skull's pretty beautiful. I'm going to, name it Caucasian. And I'm going to say that I belong to that group. That's how arbitrary the term Caucasian that is on the U.S. Census that a lot of us in the UK use is just a guy just saying, yeah, that's a beautiful skull. I'm part of those people, and that's it. And it shows you just how random and arbitrary race is, and how we've been forced into these categories. And in the U.S., especially when it comes to the census, that's when you realize how ridiculous it is, because you're then forced to essentially push yourself into a boundary that the government has put because they want to make it easier for them to count. I'll go through this story quite quickly, but I really want to talk about the mutability and expansion of what we call whiteness. And this is because, as I said, when Italians would come into the U.S., they were not looked upon as white. A lot of Northern Europeans saw them as inferior, as criminal by nature. They were lynched. And it was at this time that there was an insurrection of Italians in America saying, hey, we've come all the way from Italy to come to this land of promise, and it's not delivering. And that's when America essentially had to go back and retell its origin story and actually put an Italian at the center of it. So the whole idea of Columbus Day was purposeful in order to bring Italians into this expanded definition of what Americanness is and what whiteness is. So Italians were like, hey, guys, petitioning to the U.S. government saying, we're not part of the story, we were being lynched. America said, hey, by the way, did you know that you guys were the original Americans? And then that then expanded what whiteness and Italianness means. And I'll go into what we talk when we talk about systemic racism. So this is a great tweet that I always use: is systemic racism does not mean there are lots of racists in the system, which a lot of people think it does. It means that even if there was zero racists present, the system would still disproportionately harm people of certain races. I think that's a really great definition of it. If you look at the Empire Windrush scandal, it wasn't because individual people working in the home offices were like, I'm going to prevent people from Korean backgrounds from settling in the UK from being citizens. It was because the system itself had a fundamental issue. And so you might have brought in history students to work in that system. If you cannot change that system, it would always give you a result that was disproportionately harming people of certain races. You guys will all have known about the A.B. Cooper situation. I think it was back in May, where a white woman in Central Park with a dog called the police when she was confronted by an African-American man to leash her dog. And she said, she told him, I'm going to call the police and tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. This is an example of systemic racism, because she understood that in America, the police disproportionately harm Black people. So she was actually saying, I'm going to summon the system to do the system's job. The police does not their code of conduct is not we're going out to harm black people. The police is objectively to protect and serve everyone. But she understood how the system works. She understood that if you let the system run as it does now, it's likely that they're going to bring harm to a black person. So she was just saying, I'm just going to call the police, and the police are going to do what they're going to do. That is intentionally utilizing a system because you know about the system's faults. It's possible, and we've seen other cases where someone is not saying, I'm going to call them because I know they're going to harm you, but they're essentially just doing the same thing of, all right, I'm just going to invoke the system, and the system will do its job. And in this case, to bring it more into concrete terms that you guys would be familiar with, if we think about job interviews, where someone says, oh, she's great, but I don't think she's the right fit. Talking about, a black woman with dreads, for example. People are doing this on an individual level, saying, oh, she has a good CV, she'll be right for the company, we know she can do it, but our clients are, old white men from Oxbridge. I don't think that they would gel with her, so we're not going to hire her. So it might seem benevolent, right? Because you're like, oh, you know what? This is great, but we always socialize in the pub, and this person has a hijab. She's a Muslim. I'm not really sure she's going to have a good time here. So everyone is making these individual decisions that are, not racist. But then when you multiply that by all the agencies, by all the companies in an industry, you then realize, oh, wow, we're all individually not racist, but somehow the system is always producing the same thing. An industry that is, in PR, 92% white in the UK, in diverse cities like London, Birmingham, Manchester. In fact, in PR specifically, you had a situation where we've gone in decline from 11% BAME back in 2015 to 8% last year. And it's these systemic issues that we need to be aware of, because it's these individual situations that people are not being directly hostile, they're not being directly discriminatory, but they're making all these small micro decisions that all add up to having a big systemic effect. That's what we mean when we say systemic racism. And there's a good quote by Ibram X. Kendi about, the opposite of racism not being not racist, it's being anti-racist. And that's actively working against these things, actively working against racism. And I say a fundamental aspect of that is building trust. And what I mean by that is asking yourself the question, especially as a white Brit, about, are you comfortable if there's a situation where you've witnessed racism and it's just with your family or it's just with your other white friends, can you actually say to yourself that if a black friend or a black colleague were here, they'd trust me to stand up? Because it's one thing to say, oh, I abhor racism. It's another thing to actually, in situations where you've witnessed it, where you've seen it, to actually say, hey, this is wrong, I'm going to do something against it. So it's about asking yourselves, what uncomfortable conversations are you having with friends and your family about being anti-racist? This is not about being the killjoy. It's not about, just walking into every conversation saying, oh, hey guys, today we're going to talk about slavery. That's not what I'm suggesting here. But I'm saying it's about arming yourself with the knowledge, arming yourself with the education, arming yourself with the tools to know how to challenge racism when you see it, when it comes up. And it's also remembering that the fight's never going to be done. You're never going to reach peak anti-racism. But it's understanding that you want to get to a place where you can honestly say that your non-white colleague is going to trust that you'll fight for them when they're not there. So, as I said, it's about thinking about the last time you witnessed something personally that was racist, and asking yourself what you did in that situation. Were you quiet? Did you stand up to it? Did you call them out publicly? Did you call them out directly afterwards? It's these situations, if we just talk about it without actually doing anything about it, nothing actually changes. So going forward, I strongly believe that organizations can be agents of change, and they're never going to be responsible for fixing societal racism, but companies have the power, because they are organizations in the basic term, of starting these massive cultural conversations. And if you look at Nike with Colin Kaepernick, is an organization saying, all right, if you're going to buy our product, we are going to start a dialogue with you about systemic issues in America, right? And that's a slight shift in narrative, because you have people who might not be concerned about these macro issues actually saying, oh wow, this is a brand I love, this is a brand I engage with, and they actually want me to go out and learn something new, do something different, be better in a way. And I'm not trying to suggest that the only way out of systemic racism is through mega corporations. No, that would be yielding too much power to capitalist organizations to fix society. There's a lot more we have to do deeper than that. But it's understanding the value of having organizations that by nature organize. And I'll give you an example of what we did at Manifest. We made Juneteenth a public holiday. I'm sure a lot of you are saying to yourself, what the hell is Juneteenth? As an agency that has an office in the U.S., there's a day called Juneteenth, which is the day where African Americans celebrate the emancipation of slavery, from slavery rather. And it's a holiday in some states, and in Texas it is. But this year there was renewed, I guess, understanding and engagement with what Juneteenth is and its importance. And what we did is say, right, we're going to make it a public holiday, because by doing that, and by having that in our out of office when you email us, and by engaging with clients and saying, hey guys, we're going to take this Friday off with late notice, we start a conversation that otherwise would never have been had. So that is a small step in fixing society's issues at large. And before I stop and we go into the Q&A, there are various approaches to tackling racism that I think we can all start to engage with. And there's pros and cons to each. I don't think, and I don't suggest that only one specific way works. It has to be a merger of a lot of ways, and also has to be quite unique and bespoke to the situation at hand. And there is, if you look at, go into this slide, if you look at the informative approach, for example, this is teaching, the facts about racial advantage and disadvantage and slavery, just informing people about these things. An advantage to that is that, people understand the history, and they understand the sort of complex societal issues that led to the problems we have today. A drawback of that is that there's now an assumption that racism is just irrational or ignorant. And that's obviously just a small part of racism. You have very smart, non-ignorant, very wise, informed people who are also racist. There's the multicultural approach, which is just suggesting that, we can form a bond, we can build closer ties by encouraging people to appreciate other cultures. A good advantage of that is that, you're actually going to find some people who have never actually engaged with another culture before and have just been clouded by ignorance. But once they get into contact, they get a better, holistic, more nuanced understanding. A drawback of that could also be that, people just look at racism and multiculturalism as something, to engage with from time to time. You just, eat certain foods and dress up in certain ways, and that's it, kumbaya. So just engaging with these things in a multi-varied way, of understanding that there's the informative method, there's a multicultural method, there's a moralistic method, punitive methods as well. If there is racism in the workplace, what do you do? Do you discipline the person? Do you fire them? Those, understanding what the advantages of those things can be, understanding what the disadvantages could also be, and using that to make a wise, reasoned decision. And finally, another thing, this is more specific to the PR industry, is the Blueprint Diversity Mark, which was launched around June, and encourages agencies to apply and abide by 23 commitments. And some of this I've put here is, when you can measure things like, or a diversity, an ethnic pay gap, for example, having things like a client charter, and understanding that if you're not measuring things, then you're probably not placing too much value into it. So I encourage everyone to actually take a look at the blueprint. Think of if your agency is ready to apply. If your agency isn't ready to apply, you can also look at the commitment and start the journey on your own. But that's a good start to actually diversifying the industry. So yeah, this is it, and really excited to hear what questions you guys all have.
That was fantastic, Julian. So interesting. I think it's definitely the definition that you give of systemic racism is so true, and it's kind of like, right, we've all got to play our part really in changing our behaviors, changing our attitudes, and rather than just kind of saying, well, I'm not a racist, I don't write All Lives Matter on forums, so therefore I'm not part of the problem. So it's really kind of holding every single one of us to account. So I think that's really important. So Q&A is absolutely open. So get your questions in there and I will go through them. Let's have a look at the poll before we go any further. So I'm going to end the polling now. So we asked, have you ever felt discriminated against in the workplace? It's actually kind of more kind of an even split than I would have thought. So we've got 51% saying yes, 41% saying no, and then 7% saying not sure. So what do you take away from that, Julian? Do you think that's reflective of the industry or are you surprised or not surprised by it?
No, I'm not necessarily surprised by it. Because I think another really important thing around D&I is to understand that there are going to be certain situations, there are going to be individual stories that do not fit larger trends. And if we try and have solutions that are not bespoke, then you're always going to have this situation where people feel as though they should look for discrimination in order to feel like they're telling an authentic story, or in order to feel like they are part of the general narrative trend. So, I'm lucky that I've been a manifest essentially all my life in PR. And it's always been an open and inclusive place. So I do not have stories of discrimination to share. And I've been on panels where, the question has come, with an assumption that there's been, a kind of struggle against something. And perhaps if I'd worked in other agencies, that would be the case. But I'm not the best person to talk about that because that has not been my experience. I've been observing, I've heard stories, I've been working on how to solve things in the industry at large. But yeah, I'm not surprised by that split. And in another poll, in another situation with different participants, it could skew either way as well.
Yeah, totally. I think, that speaks volumes for Manifest as well. I think the fact that you've said you've been there kind of your career and you're like not had negative experiences. So, a lovely little kind of bonus for them as well. Like what a fantastic agency to work for that has always been so inclusive and kind of welcoming as well. That's really, really positive. So I'm going to ask you a few questions that I've got. I can see we've already got questions flooding in, so I don't want to overlook them at all. So do you think the PR industry has become more inclusive over the last 10 years? Unfortunately, obviously, like you said, with the kind of percentage of BAME people in the industry, that's gone down. So maybe it has or hasn't.
I don't think it has. I think recently, there's more of an understanding of why it's important. So I do think things are going to start changing. I think for a long time, diversity had just been a buzzword that was used. I think a lot of agencies and the industry started giving itself a pat on the back instead of actually fixing things, and that's because people do not understand what the real problems were, and also because the status quo works. So there's I hear talk about a diversity dividend at times, and also there's this famous McKinsey report that shows that diverse companies actually do better financially, but companies that are not diverse also do well.
Yeah.
And there's really no incentive to change. So that's why I think the financial argument might have some merit, but really it's about a value that goes beyond finance. It has to be important to you as an individual beyond.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true, isn't it? That if the results are still coming in and the person doesn't, the people at the top don't have as much of an interest or passion for it, it's like, why change stuff if it's kind of working, so to speak?
Exactly.
So have you got any piece of advice you'd give to white industry leaders on how they can be anti-racist?
I'd say it has to be a personal interest. So before doing the work of finding out what initiatives and programs you can bring into the workplace, you have to be enthusiastic about wanting to do this. I think that's the most important thing. It can't be delegated to HR. It can't be delegated to the one black employee. It has to be something that the entire agency or the entire business can look on and see, okay, that's coming from leadership. Leadership are serious about this. Leadership are engaged in this. In every meeting, leadership is there. So there just has to be prioritized.
Yeah, but I think it's definitely leading from the top, and then if you've got kind of your colleagues at the bottom kind of pushing it up, and then you've got people at the top saying it down, hopefully you kind of get a well-rounded position ultimately. So we've got some fantastic questions coming in from the audience here. So question to you is, do you reject clients / work based on their lack of diversity and inclusion? And how do you push clients to be anti-racist?
Right. We would. So that's a situation of rejecting work has not come up, but situations where we've been engaged with existing clients and picking especially brand ambassadors and celebrity talent, that's where that issue usually arises. And what we've done is been insistent that we will not continue the work until the talent pool is diversified. And you'd be surprised after discussions with clients, they get it, they understand, and it forces them to have a reckoning internally about why they have these blind spots. But also it has to come from a place of not just saying, guys, can we just put in one black person? Everyone in the agency, everyone in those discussions is conversant with the issues to engage with it in a intelligent and reasonable and fair way. We do push all our clients if we see a situation arising.
Yeah, I think that's really good. It's kind of it's getting them to look at it. It's kind of encouraging that discussion with them, and if they're using an agency for their talent, it's encouraging that discussion. So again, it's passing that message through various channels, kind of with one person, with Manifest starting that conversation. I think it's a really good, positive idea. So I've got another question here, and it kind of ties into one of mine as well. So I'm going to expand on it if that person doesn't mind. What advice would you give to people starting a career in PR now? And also, would you recommend a career in PR to somebody who is BAME?
I would. I really would. And the advice I'd give is never bite your tongue. And so if you're ever in a situation where you feel like you're not being, if you feel you're being discriminated against, if you feel you're not being listened to, if you feel like your contributions that are based on your knowledge, based on your understanding of issues that many white Brits might not understand, if you feel like that's not being listened to, push on, push harder. And there are going to be situations where that might meet resistance. There are going to be situations where that's actually going to breed deeper understanding and would be a valuable contribution all around. So I think that there's a lot of scope for growth, a lot of scope for understanding, and I do think that the industry in general is more serious now. So I definitely recommend it.
That's fantastic. That's good. Positive to know. So we're very close to coming to the end, but I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions. So I'm going to go for a long one and then a shorter one. So this is really, really interesting, quite a useful one here. Hello, this was really interesting. We're looking to write and communicate an internal and external comms campaign around Black History Month. Please can you give us some tips on how to balance the different needs of employees, celebrating versus critical review of the situation, gaining input from BAMA staff, working group without them feeling like we're asking to do our work for us. Thank you. So I think it's kind of almost 2 questions, but it's really, really good.
Yeah, it comes up a lot, even beyond Black History Month. And I think that's, as I said, if we engage with systemic racism as an issue that only affects Black people, or like white people are not necessarily don't have skin in the game, as I said, then that's always going to breed some kind of resentment when it's time to talk about things like Black history. So you just necessarily default to your Black employees. And in many situations, those Black employees might be junior members of staff. And they're like, we're not skilled in this at all, and now you're putting all this weight on us. So the important thing is to start the process of equipping and educating and engaging with history, with Black history as a white person, independent of your Black employees, so that when it comes time to actually have these nuanced discussions, when it comes time to building programs and writing content, you're coming from a place of mutual intelligence. You're coming from a place of trying to raise standards and do good work. And it's balancing things. So Black life and Black history is not just a story of pain and subjugation and powerlessness. It's also a story of pride and color and laughter. So it's understanding through engagement, through discussion, through a strategy of what you want your Black history story to ultimately tell. Doing that from a place of knowledge. So just keep doing the hard work, keep doing the learning.
Yeah, I think the key there is kind of education, really, and always learning, reading, watching, listening to as much kind of content, especially like historical content out there. And kind of, if you don't understand something, kind of get on the internet, find as many resources as you can to educate yourself. It's fantastic. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions, actually. I told the flippins that I wasn't going to do one. So this kind of ties into it regarding language. What's your opinion on terms used to categorize non-white people, such as BAME or POC or BIPOC? It sometimes feels counterproductive and not really encouraging diversity to group people together into an acronym.
Yeah, from time to time I have issues with some of these terms because sometimes they obfuscate rather than clarify. And it comes back to the fact that we have these strange racial categories that we try and fit. And usually it's just it's relative or relational to whiteness. Mm-hmm. So if you look, for example, at the conversation around how COVID-19 is affecting BAME communities, what does that tell you just in that phrase of COVID-19 disproportionately affects BAME communities. When you drill down to that, you can actually see that COVID-19 actually is very, very, very dangerous when it comes to Bangladeshi communities. So BAME, it puts you in a neighborhood, but doesn't actually give you the right address. And so I think that there are times when people want to say black and they say BAME. There are times when people need to say Bangladeshi or need to say Pakistani or need to say South Asian and they say BAME. So I do think that we have to be careful with our language, and if we can be specific, we need to be specific, and we need to get away from the discomfort on trying to be hyper-specific at times, because we feel like it might make other non-white folks excluded. And also, language will always change or would always change over time. If you look at, in the U.S., going from Negro to colored to black to African American to an increased use of black, language is always malleable. It's always changing. It's always shifting. But yeah, I always encourage specificity as much as you can. And also, there are times when it might seem like a mouthful to say black, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan. Say it. If you can, say it.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, actually. I think that's fantastic as well to say, like, if you need to describe somebody, or kind of if you're talking about somebody like a black person, call them a black person. Don't try and be too politically correct, because you're actually being more offensive to that person. Exactly. So I'm going to do one more question because I can see people are dropping off. So this is kind of a bit of a tough one, but how would you navigate around working with a client that has made comments that have racial undertones? So hard on that one.
I'd say bring it up. Definitely bring it up. There was a report. There was a story in the CIPR's report on race, which came out in June, where a black member of staff had complained that a client was always denigrating their work, and so the white superiors looked at the work and said, no, this work is actually really good. This work is actually quality. So the only reason why you keep on getting problems is because this client is racist. What did the agency do? The agency said, you know what, we're going to take you off the account. We're not going to make you client-facing anymore, so we're going to deal with this instead. That is a completely wrong approach. When you have situations like this, it has to be firm. It has to be rooted in the values of an organization. You have to protect your staff. You have to go back to the client and say, this is racist. This is why it's racist, and engage with that in an honest way. If it means that client has to be resigned, do it. Because you have to stand in values. Yes, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yes, there's difficult times, and resigning a client is not necessarily the easiest thing to do financially, but in the long term, your value is with your staff. You have to stand up for them, protect them, stand by them, and yeah. I always say stand up for that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, you hear kind of like, oh, that's how they are, like, especially when it's an older person, that was how they spoke, and it's like, that's not good enough now. It's not a good enough response. So I think it's kind of saying, like you said, enough is enough, and if that means that they don't want to work with you, fine. Do you know what? We'd rather not work with somebody who's racist anyway, so
exactly.
No big problem to us. So I've had a question asking, will the slides be shared afterwards? So it'd be great if you could send them over to me. Absolutely. Any other resources? I saw that you had a couple of worksheets. If you could send them over, and then I can send them out to everybody that's attended, and for those that couldn't join us today. We have had several more questions, but I just don't think we're going to have time. So I'll send them over to you, Julian. We can get your thoughts on them, and we can put together like a blog post around it, answering these questions. But the feedback that I'm getting in the chat already has been really, really useful, really great. I think you're definitely making people think and rethink and re-question and re-educate themselves. And I think it's the beginning of a journey for many of us, but hopefully it's we're going in the right direction. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry we've run out of time, everybody. But I'd just like to say thank you again to Julian. You've been absolutely fantastic, and well done again on your promotion. Yes, so I think that's everything. Thank you to everybody for joining us though today and for all your questions.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.